The rain fell hard on the fortress courtyard, each drop echoing against the cobblestones like the pounding of war drums. The reluctant hero, Thomas Gray, stood with trembling hands, his sword heavy in the air. He had been ordered to execute a captured enemy, but his heart rebelled. The prisoner, a young messenger barely older than 20, pleaded with his eyes, though his lips never moved. Captain Marcus, the power-hungry opportunist, said, "Do it, Gray. Show the nation you are loyal." Thomas felt his chest tighten, his breath catching as he looked around. Citizens huddled beneath dripping cloaks, whispering behind shuttered windows, their faces pale with fear. The betrayer within, his supposed comrade Daniel, whispered, "Obey, or they'll turn on you." In that moment Thomas saw his future unravel. If he struck, he would lose his soul. If he refused, he would lose his life. The storm above roared, as though the heavens themselves awaited his decision. The narrator spoke of the silence that followed Marcus's command, a silence more deafening than the thunder. Thomas felt the crowd's breath pressing on his shoulders, their judgment as heavy as the sword in his hand. He remembered his mother's voice, whispering once, "Never stain your soul with another man's blood." Daniel hissed again, "Strike him now before Marcus turns on you." Thomas whispered under his breath, "This is not justice." The prisoner lowered his head, accepting death, his soaked hair plastered against his skin. For one agonizing heartbeat, Thomas considered it the swift end to his torment. But deep inside something burned, not defiance, but the flicker of duty to a truth greater than Marcus's hunger for power. The storm raged on, as though history itself waited for his choice. The prisoner's chains clinked softly as he shifted, eyes shutting with quiet resignation. The narrator told how the boy seemed less afraid of death than of the injustice staining the world around him. Marcus's voice cut sharp as steel, "Do it, or I will." The guards straightened, eager to obey their commander's cruelty. Thomas's breath grew ragged, heart hammering. He thought of the children watching behind the bars, their wide eyes reflecting terror. "If I kill him, I am no better than Marcus," Thomas thought. Daniel whispered, "Do not falter, survive." For a brief moment, Thomas saw in the prisoner's calm face a reflection of himself, bound to fate by others' hands. That realization pierced deeper than any blade. The narrator described Marcus stepping forward, his polished boots splashing into the mud, his armored hand reaching to seize the sword. "Weakness shames the nation," Marcus spat, his voice thundering like the storm. Thomas recoiled, heart pounding, his mind screaming to resist. Daniel pulled at his arm, desperate to keep him from falling further into danger. "Obey him, Thomas, please," Daniel urged, fear cracking his voice. The prisoner opened his eyes again, calm and steady, his lips forming the silent words, "Do not." In that instant, thunder rolled, lightning flared, and Thomas realized the battle was not against Marcus alone, but against history's judgment itself. The narrator's voice trembled as it spoke of Thomas's breaking point. The crowd gasped as Marcus lunged closer, his armored hand clamping onto the sword's hilt. "If you cannot serve, you will die as traitor," Marcus growled. Thomas's arm shook violently, but he held on. Daniel's voice faltered. "Thomas, let go." For the first time, Thomas shouted, "No!" His voice carried above the storm, silencing the whispers. The prisoner's eyes widened in shock and gratitude. A spark of hope ignited. Rain hammered the courtyard as thunder clapped, marking the moment when Thomas chose defiance over blind obedience. The reluctant hero's fate was sealed, and history would remember this act of resistance. The narrator described how Thomas staggered into the barracks, his uniform drenched, boots leaving muddy trails across the stone floor. He leaned against the wall, gasping as the storm still echoed outside. His hand shook uncontrollably. The sword's weight burned into his memory. Daniel followed, slamming the door shut, hissing, "You've doomed us both." Thomas turned, his face pale, his eyes burning with a strange resolve. "No," he whispered, "I've kept my soul." The silence inside was broken only by the creak of the rafters and the steady drip of rainwater pooling from their clothes. The narrator said that in this moment, the reluctant hero began to see what he stood to lose, not just his life, but the fragile thread of dignity binding his nation together. The narrator spoke of Thomas's thoughts drifting to his mother's farmhouse, the warmth of her voice, the scent of fields now lost to flames. He closed his eyes, seeing his younger sister's smile, knowing she waited in the countryside unaware of the bloodshed looming. Daniel muttered, pacing the room, "We cannot stand against Marcus. He'll crush us." Thomas whispered, "If I surrender, I lose them before the battle even begins." The weight of family, faith, and dignity pressed against his chest, harder than any sword. The storm outside softened, yet his mind roared louder, torn between survival and sacrifice. His hands clenched until his knuckles blanched, the decision carving itself into his very bones. The narrator described how dawn crept through the shutters, golden light fighting to pierce the gloom. Thomas sat on a rough bench, staring at his sword lying on the table. The blade glimmered faintly, mocking him with its silence. Daniel muttered, "You'll bring ruin to everyone if you keep this path." Thomas's voice was low, steady now. "Perhaps ruin comes either way, but if I bend, all is lost." His reflection in the steel revealed a man no longer just a soldier, but a symbol of fragile hope. The air smelled of damp stone, candle smoke, and fear. The narrator said Thomas realized that his burden was not only his own survival, but carrying the dignity of those who could not fight for themselves. The narrator told how the door creaked open, and a boy entered, Samuel, the innocent witness, barely 17. His wide eyes scanned the room, his voice shaking. "They say Marcus is gathering names. Yours is first." Thomas studied him, seeing youth unscarred by war, a reflection of innocence he feared was already dead. "Go back home, Samuel," Thomas said softly. "This is no place for you." The boy shook his head, trembling. "I cannot. If you fall, we all fall." Daniel cursed under his breath, muttering, "Fools leading fools." The moment carried a weight deeper than fear. It carried hope born from fragile voices unwilling to vanish. The narrator said that as the morning stretched into a pale, trembling light, Thomas rose to his feet. His shadow stretched long across the stone floor, as though history itself rose with him. "If Marcus comes for me, I will face him," Thomas declared, voice firm. Samuel's eyes brightened, fragile hope flickering like a candle against the storm. Daniel shook his head, despair etched across his face, muttering, "Then we are already dead." But the narrator insisted that in Thomas's trembling hands and burning eyes, there lay the seed of defiance that no storm could wash away. Outside, church bells tolled, their echoes rolling across the broken city like a prophecy yet to unfold. The narrator spoke of how the city square pulsed with tension, banners snapping in the cold wind as soldiers marched through muddy streets. Thomas stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding like the war drums echoing from the hills. Captain Marcus rode past on a black horse, armor polished, his smile sharpened like a blade. The citizens lowered their heads, whispers trailing in the air, fearing to meet his gaze. Daniel leaned close, voice grim. "He knows what you did." Samuel tugged at Thomas's sleeve, whispering, "We cannot stay here." Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes scanning faces that were both terrified and broken. The narrator revealed that Marcus thrived in this fear, his presence alone stoking chaos. History pressed down on Thomas's chest as the weight of choice returned, heavier than before. The narrator described how the crowd was ordered to kneel, but Thomas remained frozen, his body refusing to bend. Marcus's eyes cut toward him, gleaming with cruel recognition. Daniel hissed through clenched teeth, "For God's sake, kneel!" Samuel stared, wide-eyed, unable to move. Thomas's breath caught, his knees trembling, yet pride anchored him in place. "If I kneel," he whispered, "I kneel forever." The crowd gasped as Marcus slowed his horse, dismounting with deliberate menace. His boots sank into the mud, each step measured, like a predator closing in. The narrator explained that every heartbeat seemed to echo across the square, silence stretching until it cracked under the thunder of Marcus's voice. The narrator said Marcus approached, mud splashing as he stopped before Thomas. His hand hovered near the hilt of his sword, his eyes narrowing. "You dare defy me in front of your people?" Marcus growled. Thomas's throat tightened, words struggling against fear, but he forced them out. "I will not kneel to tyranny." Gasps spread through the crowd, like sparks threatening to ignite. Daniel clutched Thomas's arm, whispering frantically, "Hell kill you now." Samuel trembled, his voice breaking. "Please, Thomas." The air thickened, the smell of sweat, rain, and smoke suffocating. The narrator explained that this defiance shattered the silence, painting Thomas not as a man, but as a spark of rebellion waiting to be consumed. The narrator told how Marcus's hand tightened on his sword, but instead of striking, he laughed coldly, the sound cutting through the square like steel. "Very well," Marcus said, voice rising. "Let all see this traitor who dares stand against his nation's savior." The soldiers shifted, armor clanking, forming a wall around Thomas. Daniel's face drained of color, whispering, "This is a trap." Samuel reached for Thomas's arm, whispering, "We can still run." Thomas looked around, the citizens' faces reflecting both terror and a fragile glimmer of courage. The narrator explained that in Marcus's cruelty, he inadvertently breathed life into defiance. A storm was forming, not just in the skies, but in the hearts of those watching. The narrator spoke of how Marcus turned to the crowd, raising his hand. "This man chooses treachery," he declared, "and treachery deserves no mercy." His voice carried across the square, echoing against stone walls. Thomas's chest heaved, but his gaze remained steady, locked on Marcus. Daniel whispered, "You've sealed our fate." Samuel whispered, "You've given them hope." The soldiers advanced a step closer, spears leveled, the air tightening like a noose. The narrator explained that though death loomed over him, Thomas's stand had already broken something greater than Marcus' grip. It had broken fear. The square itself seemed to hold its breath, as though history prepared to turn. The narrator described how night fell heavy on the city, the square empty now, except for shadows and whispers. Thomas was dragged into a torch-lit chamber beneath the fortress, stone walls slick with damp. Chains rattled as soldiers shoved him into the center. Marcus sneered from his chair, goblet in hand. "You think yourself a hero, Gray? You are nothing." Thomas lifted his head, battered but unbroken, and replied, "I am what you fear most, a man who refuses to kneel." Daniel, standing in the shadows, avoided Thomas's eyes. The narrator revealed that betrayal already simmered near. Marcus leaned forward, his voice venomous, "And now you will watch as your own betray you." The narrator told how Marcus rose, pacing slowly, boots striking stone. He motioned, and from the far door a figure emerged, cloaked, steps silent, face hidden in shadow. The room held its breath as the stranger lowered the hood. It was Samuel. Gasps echoed, but Marcus laughed. "Your little witness carries a secret he never dared share." Samuel's voice shook. "I never wanted this." He revealed a crest sewn inside his ragged tunic, the mark of the royal bloodline thought to be extinguished. Thomas's eyes widened, whispering, You are the heir." The narrator explained that the innocent witness was no mere bystander. He was the key to a nation's survival. The narrator described Thomas's disbelief as Samuel's confession filled the chamber. "I was hidden to protect me from men like him," Samuel said, trembling, "but I cannot hide anymore." Marcus's laughter cut like a blade. "An heir without an army is still nothing." Daniel's face tightened, torn between loyalty and fear, whispering, "This will destroy us all." Thomas's voice rang clear, "No, this changes everything." The narrator revealed that in the flickering torchlight, history shifted. Samuel was no longer a frightened boy, but a symbol powerful enough to challenge Marcus's dominion. And for the first time Thomas saw not just hope, but a path forward. The narrator told how Marcus, realizing the danger, ordered his guards to seize Samuel. Torches flared as armored men advanced. Samuel froze, terror gripping him, but Thomas shouted, "Run!" The boy hesitated, torn between fear and duty. Daniel stepped forward, his voice breaking, "No, he stays." Thomas's eyes narrowed, realizing the betrayal at last. You, he said bitterly, you've been with him all along. Daniel's face twisted with anguish. I had no choice. They threatened my family. The narrator explained that the betrayer within was finally unmasked, yet his torment revealed he was not driven by malice, but by chains of his own. The narrator described the chamber, erupting in chaos. Samuel darted toward the doorway, guards lunging to block him. Thomas strained against his chains, veins bulging, shouting his defiance. Marcus bellowed, "The heir will die tonight." Daniel stood torn, his hand half raised, his face pale with indecision. Samuel's eyes shone with terror, yet in them burned a flicker of courage. "If I die, the people will know," he cried. The narrator explained that the revelation of Samuel's identity shattered the balance of power. No matter what happened next, the world would no longer see Thomas as a lone rebel. The heir's existence had changed everything. The narrator described the night air inside the fortress thick with smoke and torchlight. Samuel was hidden by allies in the lower passages, while Thomas remained chained, blood trickling from his wrists. Marcus paced above, declaring, "The heir is mine, and his death will secure my rule." His words echoed off the stone, carried into the ears of the guards who tightened their grips on spears. Daniel lingered near, his shoulders slumped, torn between guilt and obedience. Thomas raised his head, eyes burning. "You mistake fear for loyalty," he rasped. The narrator said that in that chamber, the true lines of war were being drawn, not on the battlefield, but in hearts bound by duty, betrayal, and fragile hope. The narrator spoke of how the city stirred with unrest. Citizens whispered in alleys, word of an heir spreading like wildfire. Soldiers marched heavily through streets, drums beating, but their eyes betrayed unease. Thomas, still captive, felt the ripple of change even from within his chains. Daniel muttered bitterly, "You've doomed us with hope." Thomas replied, voice steady, "Hope is the only weapon they fear." Outside bells tolled, their mournful echoes rising above the rain. Samuel, hidden in the shadows, repeated to himself, "I cannot fail them." The narrator explained that the tide was shifting, not by armies, but by the courage of those who refused to bow. The narrator described the confrontation sharpening inside the dungeon. Marcus leaned close to Thomas, sneering, "You think the people will rise? They kneel because they crave order." Thomas's breath was ragged, but he forced out, "They kneel because they fear you. One spark will burn that fear to ash." Daniel's face twisted, his voice breaking, "Stop, both of you. This ends with blood." Marcus laughed coldly. "It always does." The guards shifted nervously, their faith cracking. The narrator revealed that Marcus's arrogance and Thomas's defiance struck like flint and steel, each word sparking against the other, drawing the city closer to a fire that could no longer be contained. The narrator said that Samuel was led through hidden tunnels by the shadow figure, a cloaked woman with eyes sharp as blades. Her identity remained veiled, but her voice carried authority. "You must survive," she told him, "for survival itself is victory." Samuel trembled, asking, "Why help me?" The figure's tone was low, calm. "Because your death would kill more than a boy. It would kill the last thread of hope." Samuel nodded, his fear tempered by resolve. The narrator revealed that unseen forces were moving, not all loyal to Marcus, and in this secrecy the foundation of rebellion took shape. The narrator described the moment when Marcus raised his goblet high in the fortress hall, soldiers cheering hollowly around him. "By dawn the heir will hang," he proclaimed. Yet whispers in the crowd betrayed doubt. Thomas, chained below, closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "If I fall, let it mean something." Daniel stood apart, shadows hiding his tears. "I cannot undo what I've done," he whispered. The narrator explained that by the time the torches dimmed and the hall grew quiet, the city had already chosen sides. The storm outside howled, and within it, the seeds of open rebellion took root. The narrator described how dawn broke under a crimson sky, the storm still raging as thunder rolled across the fortress. Chains shattered as Thomas, aided by unseen allies, tore free from the dungeon. Guards lunged forward, but his hand seized a fallen blade, steel flashing in the dim light. Marcus roared from the hall above, "End this traitor now!" The clash of steel echoed as the battle erupted within narrow corridors. Daniel, torn in two, hovered at the threshold shouting, "This will destroy us all." Thomas's breath burned in his chest, yet his voice carried over the storm. "No, it will free us." The narrator explained that in this chaos, the hero's defiance reached its peak, igniting hope with every stroke of his blade. The narrator told how the fortress courtyard transformed into a battlefield. Soldiers poured from the gates, their boots thundering in rhythm with the storm above. Samuel, hidden among allies, watched with trembling resolve. Marcus strode into the rain-soaked square, his sword gleaming, eyes burning with fury. "Bring me Gray's head," he commanded, voice rising over thunder. Thomas emerged from the shadows, face streaked with blood and rain, his blade raised. "You will not have him," he shouted, eyes locking with Marcus. The crowd of citizens gathered at the edges, holding their breath. The narrator explained that the storm was no longer just in the skies, but alive in the hearts of all who witnessed the defiance. The narrator spoke of steel colliding, sparks flying as Thomas and Marcus met in the heart of the storm. Marcus's strength drove Thomas backward, their blades ringing like thunderclaps. "You think history will remember your mercy?" Marcus snarled. "It remembers victors." Thomas's jaw clenched, his arms straining, and he answered, "It remembers those who dare to stand." Rain blinded them, mud splashed beneath their boots, and the square shook with the weight of their duel. Daniel shouted from the sidelines, torn between both sides, while Samuel whispered a prayer, clutching the crest beneath his tunic. The narrator said that every strike carried not just steel but the weight of history itself. The narrator described how Marcus gained ground, forcing Thomas to his knees, his blade pressing down with brutal strength. "You are nothing," Marcus growled, his face twisted with triumph. Thomas gasped, his arms quaking, but his eyes did not falter. "I am the voice you cannot silence," he whispered. Suddenly Samuel stepped from the crowd, cloak thrown back, the crest visible. "He fights for me!" he shouted. The citizens gasped, whispers surging like wildfire. Marcus turned his head, momentarily stunned, and Thomas seized the moment, driving his blade upward with desperate strength. The narrator explained that the tide had turned, the truth unmasked before all. The narrator said Marcus staggered back, blood spilling as Thomas's blade struck true. Silence swept the courtyard, broken only by the storm's roar. Marcus collapsed to his knees, eyes wide with disbelief. "This nation is mine," he gasped before falling into the mud. Thomas, battered and bleeding, stood over him, sword trembling in his hand. The citizens erupted in shouts, not of fear, but of hope. Samuel lifted his voice, declaring, "The heir lives, and the tyrant is fallen." Daniel sank to his knees, tears mixing with rain. The narrator explained that the climax had come, victory won, but at a price written in blood and sacrifice. The narrator described the storm easing into a pale dawn, light spilling across the battered courtyard. Citizens gathered, their voices hushed, eyes fixed on Thomas, who leaned heavily on his sword. His body trembled, blood soaking his torn uniform, but his stance remained unbroken. Samuel stepped forward, crest in hand, his youthful voice shaking but clear. "The heir lives. The future remains." The people murmured, courage replacing fear. Daniel knelt nearby, head bowed, whispering, "Forgive me." Thomas's gaze softened, though pain carved deep into his features. The narrator explained that the tide of history had shifted, but victory carried scars carved into every soul who had survived the night. The narrator spoke of how the city slowly awoke, bells tolling not in mourning, but in fragile triumph. Women carried water to the wounded, children peeked from behind cloaks, their eyes wide with wonder. Samuel, guided by the shadow figure, stood tall, his innocence hardened into responsibility. "I will not abandon them," he declared. Thomas watched silently, pride and sorrow entwined. Daniel's voice cracked, You saved us, though I betrayed you. Thomas placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, whispering, We all are prisoners of fear, Daniel. Today you are free. The narrator explained that the battle had ended, but the echoes of defiance would remain long after the storm had passed. The narrator described how Marcus's body was carried away, his fallen armor clattering like hollow echoes of tyranny. No cheers followed, only silence, for even in victory death left its shadow. Thomas turned away, his face pale, each step heavier than the last. Samuel called out, You cannot leave us, but Thomas whispered, A nation does not rise on one man's shoulders. Daniel stood beside Samuel, eyes lowered, murmuring, Yet without him we would have nothing. The narrator explained that Thomas had become more than a soldier. He was the symbol of resistance itself, though his path now demanded sacrifice beyond survival. The narrator told how Thomas paused by the city gates, the smoke of battle still curling into the morning air. The battered walls bore scars of fire, yet the people gathered behind him with cautious hope. Samuel's voice carried strong now, We will remember you. Thomas turned briefly, his eyes lingering on the boy who carried the future. Guard them well, he said, voice low, almost lost to the wind. Daniel clenched his fists, silent tears streaking his face. The narrator explained that Thomas was not walking away in shame, but in sacrifice, carrying the burden of what must be done so that others could rise without fear. The narrator described the final image as unforgettable. Thomas walked into the mist beyond the gates, his figure fading against smoke and dawn. The citizens bowed their heads, Samuel clutching the crest close to his heart, and Daniel whispering a broken prayer. The shadow figure lingered at the edge, her face unreadable, eyes fixed on the horizon. A blood-stained letter slipped from Thomas's belt, caught by the wind, drifting into the mud where it lay like a silent testament. The narrator said that history would remember not only the heir who survived, but the soldier who gave everything so hope could live. Smoke and silence swallowed him, leaving only the echo of defiance.